Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Libra and Libra rising for the month of February of 2019. Alright, so I'm doing a bit of an experiment tonight where I'm live streaming each of my 12 monthly horoscopes for February through 3 different platforms simultaneously, through YouTube, through Facebook, and through Twitter. And so for those of you who are watching the live stream now, if you have any comments or questions, let me know in the chat box, and I'll be sure to get to you at some point during the course of this. But yeah, otherwise it's a bit of an experiment. So far so good. I just finished. I'm halfway through now. I'm up to Libra. I'm not going to lie to you guys. It's been a bit of a trek, but we're getting through it. And it is now only 11:30 at night, and we are on horoscope number 7. So let's keep going. Let's jump right into it. The first horoscope, or the first thing I want to look at, is the ingress chart, which is the calendar that shows the days when different planets move into different signs of the zodiac. It also shows the 2 lunations, which is the new moon on the 4th in Aquarius and the full moon in Virgo on the 19th of February. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. The other one we need to look at is the planetary movements calendar, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and where they will end up pretty much by the end of the month, which is useful because it shows it shows not just where the planets will move through the zodiac, but also their relative speeds, where you have some inner planets that move relatively quickly through the signs, and you have some outer planets that move very slowly through the signs and hardly change at all during the course of a month. So those are the 2 calendars we're going to be looking at, but the primary chart that we're going to look at this month is the animated solar fire chart, which shows calculated positions for all of the planets on different days and times of the month. So this is the chart for February 1st with Libra rising, so that we can look at the placements of the planets relative to your whole sign house placements. And this month, one of the things that I needed to mention right at the top is that there's not a lot of outer planet transits that are majorly notable, at least in terms of the mundane astrology. So there may be some outer planet transits that go exact for you in terms of exact aspects this month, if you have any natal planets that are close to where those outer planets are now. But in terms of retrograde stations or planetary ingresses or anything like that, there's not a lot of major outer planet activity that's worth noting this month. So there will be next month when Uranus goes into Taurus, but I've got to save that discussion for the horoscopes for March. So this month then, given that being the case, we're going to focus primarily on inner planet transits, since those are going to really characterize our experience of what the next 4 weeks is going to be like once we get to February. So let's take a look at that. So here's the chart for February 1st. And the first transit that I wanted to talk about, because it kind of evenly divides the month into 2 halves, is the Mars transit, where it spends the first half of the month going through Aries and finishing up its transit through your 7th house of relationships. And then about halfway through the month, Mars changes signs and moves into Taurus by February 13th or February 14th. Moves into Taurus, it departs from your 7th house of relationships and moves into your 8th house of shared resources. So Mars, I talked about in my horoscopes last month, the horoscopes for January, which you can go back and watch on my YouTube channel that I did with Cam White. We talked a lot about that Mars transit through Aries because it's going through your 7th house of relationships, especially for those of you that have Libra rising. So Mars going through the 7th house can sometimes be a period where there's much more energy and focus on relationships, so that you're having to put a lot more work into relationships, or you're finding that, you know, maybe it can be good. So for some people, it might be something like, you know, having a major event that requires a lot of attention and requires you to put a lot of work into it. But ultimately, even though it's stressful or time consuming, it ends up being positive and constructive. So for some people, especially those of you that were born at night with night birth charts, you probably have been experiencing the more constructive end of that transit. There's another end of that transit that can be a little bit more problematic, because Mars can sometimes be associated with things like strife or separations or conflict. And when it's going through our 7th house, sometimes that can indicate a period of greater propensity towards conflict or strife with partners, whether that be romantic partners or business partnerships, like whatever the close one-on-one relationships are with other people in our life. And that's something that we want to pay attention to during the first half of February, because it kind of culminates especially towards the very end of Mars's transit through Aries when it conjoins Uranus. So right here we can see just before Mars leaves Taurus, it catches up to at 29 degrees of Aries and conjoins Uranus, which is at 29 degrees. So this happens around February 12th, February 13th. And this is a transit that I would be a little bit careful about, because while it does have some constructive manifestations where it can be like a sudden innovation in relationships or a sort of desire to take a sudden and innovative action that ends up positively reforming or changing a relationship in a constructive way through the like controlled use of one's will. While there's a constructive manifestation of that, there's also a more challenging manifestation, which can be like an unexpected conflict or fight when it comes to close one-on-one relationships or partnerships in your life around the time of that transit. So that's not necessarily going to be the case for everybody. It's going to depend on your natal chart. It's going to depend on whether Mars is activated as a Time Lord this year through annual perfections. It's going to depend on whether the 7th house is activated for you this year based on annual perfections and other things like that. But it's something I just wanted to point out as a potential to be aware of, because for some of you, a transit like this of Mars through the 7th house can either lead to you being more irritable with your partner, or your partner sometimes being more irritable with you. And sometimes that in and of itself can be the sort of psychological context that leads to the concrete physical manifestation of like a conflict or a fight or a falling out between you. So one of the constructive pieces of advice is just to be a little bit more careful about being irritable or about initiating conflicts with your partner this month, especially during the first half of the month, and especially around the time of that Mars-Uranus conjunction, just because it may have some unexpected repercussions that could be problematic and could be more major or more long-term than you intend. So basically, even though that's like always good advice, not to say something that you don't mean in the heat of the moment, or not to do something that you don't really intend to do, especially around the time of that Mars-Uranus conjunction, I would take that advice more to heart, just because the potential for it is that it could have more long-lasting meaning than you intend, even if you get into what otherwise might be just a little blow-off, fight or something with somebody at that time. All right, so that's a transit that's going on during the first half of the month. During the second half of the month, Mars departs from Aries, and it's completely done with your 7th house, and it moves into Taurus, which is the 8th house for you with Libra rising, and that's the place of shared resources. So the 8th house, some of the topics that have to do with the 8th house, the topic of shared resources seems to be one of the main ones. Other topics are like this broad general topic of other people's money in general, which can sometimes be like an umbrella term, which can include things like inheritance, taxes, debt, and other topics like that. Mars moving through that house can sometimes indicate just the need to focus more on those things or expend a lot more energy in that area of your life than normal. It can also indicate irritation or frustration surrounding issues having to do with other people's money that involves you. In some instances, it can indicate, if you're married or you have a partner, it can indicate that the partner is having financial problems for some reason, and that may or may not be indirectly affecting you. So that's a transit that's happening for the second half of the month, basically. As soon as Mars goes into your 8th house around the 13th or the 14th, and then it lasts all the way through the end of February and into March, because by the end of February, Mars has only made it to about 10 degrees of Taurus, as we can see here in solar fire. So that's a transit that, while it starts in the second half of February, it's going to continue over and take up most of March as well. So it's not necessarily going to be concluded at this time, but it's something definitely to pay attention to. during the course of the month. All right, so that's the Mars transit. The other major transit that I wanted to mention and focus on this month is the Venus transit, because Venus is going to change signs very early in the month, and it's going to spend the rest of the month in the same sign. So backing all the way up to February 1st, we can see that at the beginning of the month, Venus starts out at the very end of Sagittarius. So it's just coming off of that very nice Venus-Jupiter conjunction that happened in the early morning sky in mid to late January that we're just coming out of now. But very quickly in February, Venus ingresses into Capricorn and moves into your 4th house, which is the house of your home and living situation, as well as the house that represents your parents, your foundations, and your private life just in general. So whereas the 10th house is like your career and your public life, the 4th house is your home and your private life. So this is actually a pretty positive transit, and it's a nice sort of mitigating transit that's going to help to offset some of the more challenging transits that are going on in that house for you over the course of the past year, and that are kind of like long-term cycles that are happening at this point, especially as a result of transiting Saturn moving through Capricorn and moving through that same house, which started way back in December of 2017, and it's only about halfway through that at this point. We can see that here at the beginning of February, it's only at 15 degrees of Capricorn, which means that as a slow outer planet transit, it's only halfway through that sign. So that basically means we have another year and a half left of that transit before it's over. It's actually 2 years, I think, total of that transit before it's completely wrapped up and departs from Capricorn and moves into Aquarius. So I've talked about that transit a lot, I think, in the past month's horoscope, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but it typically, or broadly speaking, the most broad statement we can make about it is just that it has to do with challenges that are coming up with respect to your home and living situation, or potentially your parents, with Saturn going through that sign over this 3-year period. But what's important this month is that Venus's ingress into that sign is going to bring some alleviation of some of those problems, and the potential to even rectify or to help to fix or offset them in some way, which is actually very positive. So we can see Venus move into Capricorn here on February 3rd, and then not too long after that, Venus actually conjoins Saturn at 16 degrees of Capricorn on February 17th. Then a few days later, it conjoins Pluto at 22 degrees of Capricorn on February 22nd. And then eventually it squares Uranus from 29 Capricorn to 29 Aries just before it departs from that sign and moves into Aquarius by March 1st. So Venus, has some pretty heavy aspects that it's hitting at different points as it's moving through that house during especially the second half of February. But ultimately, I think, especially for some of you, those of you with night charts, that this is going to be a positive sort of counterbalancing influence on Saturn's transit through that house. And it may indicate, even if it's just a temporary respite, that it's a nice sort of break or a nice sort of vacation where there's some solutions that come along to whatever the sort of 4th house challenges are that you're going through at this time. So if you've been dealing with some sort of issue with your parents, if you've been dealing with some sort of issue with your home and living situation or your private life in general, this would be a good month to look for solutions to that. And sometimes the solution can come in the form of like another party or getting another person involved who's able to help out and help you find some sort of solution to reconcile some of the issues that you're experiencing in that area of your life. So that's from a like constructive or the most positive or constructive standpoint. That's the potential, I think, of that transit this month. And since Venus is your ruling planet, if you have Libra rising, that's even more important than in terms of Venus transiting through that sign in that house. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody listening to the live stream have any questions as we're going through here, especially if you have Libra rising about any transits? Just let me know in the comments section. All right, so Venus transiting through your 4th house, home improvement and like beautification of the home, like redesigning, redecorating the home is a pretty common manifestation of Venus transiting the 4th house. If you've had a falling out with like a parent or some other 4th house type figure, sometimes it can be a good idea to try to reach out to them to see if you can resolve that, or if you've ever had any wish that you could, then this might be a good time to attempt to do that, to sort of smooth things over and rectify things. And other general actions that you can take either with respect to your home and living situation or with respect to your parents would be your potential for success this month, I would say, would be better this month compared to other months. And that's especially going to be the case for those of you with night charts where Venus is experienced more positively, somewhat less so for those of you with day charts, although you'll still experience a sort of mild version of this, especially if Venus is activated as a Time Lord for you this year. All right, so that is the Venus transit that I wanted to focus on. Other transits going on this month in terms of inner planet transits. It looks like we've got Mercury going through Aquarius, and it goes into Pisces. Right, we've got the 2 lunations. So one of the lunations is the new moon in Aquarius in your 5th house. The 5th house has to do with, in terms of people, the 5th house has to do with children, which can sometimes be either your own children if you have children, or just the topic of children and younger people in your life in general. So a new moon in Aquarius is like a new beginning or setting a new foundation there, which will grow and develop over the next 6 months before eventually maturing and becoming a more permanent fixture in your life. So it could be some new development there. The 5th house is also romantic relationships or sort of romantic flings. So it could be the start of a new romantic relationship when that new moon takes place in, looks like the 4th of February. So you've had eclipses bouncing back and forth between Aquarius and Leo, your 5th house and your 11th house over the course of the past 2 years. So on some level, I don't want to overplay or overemphasize this lunation too much since, it's not an eclipse like the past couple of years of lunations and those signs have been. So it's not going to be as important or like monumental in all reality or in all possibility as it has been over the past few years, but it could still represent a new beginning and a new development or a new stage of development that takes place in that area with respect to children or romantic relationships. Another 5th house topic is creativity and creative pursuits. So if you're an artist or if you have any sort of creative pursuit, it can be a good time to start a new phase in your artistic work and to start working on something that's not going to have an immediate payoff, but eventually will, over the course of the next 6 months, eventually grow and develop until you start becoming more comfortable with it and becoming more successful with it. So that's the new moon that's taking place on the 4th of February. There's eventually a full moon that's going to take place in Virgo on the 19th of February in your 12th house. And the 12th house is kind of a tricky house to talk about. The 12th house has to do with sometimes people, the 11th house is traditionally the house of friends, and the 12th house is traditionally the house of enemies. So sometimes a full moon in the 12th can represent like a culmination of events with respect to your enemies, or to frame that in another way, people who work at cross purposes in your life. If there's somebody that you don't get along with for some reason in your life, that you've been having some series of events where you've been dealing with them over the course of the past 6 months, you could see things come to a sort of head or come to a culmination at this time, around the time of this full moon on the 19th. Other times, the 12th house is the last house in the cycle, and sometimes it has to do with endings. So having a full moon, which itself represents a culmination of events in the 12th house, can sometimes indicate bringing to completion or closing down some chapter of your life where you have to decide about something that's winding down that you kind of have to be prepared to let go of so that you can move on to the next phase of your life from that point forward. So there may be a little bit of a theme of endings having to do with that full moon taking place in Virgo around the 19th of the month. And let me just animate that really quickly so you can see the full moon. There it is. It takes place right at the beginning of Virgo. around the 19th of February. So those are the primary interplanet transits that I wanted to really emphasize this month. It looks like I've got some questions that came in over the course of the past few minutes, so let me take a look at those really quickly. So one person asked, Mars will be in Venus's sign, how will that bridge the houses? I mean, the primary bridge is just that Mars is moving from the 7th house into the 8th house, so it's moving from the place of relationships to the place of shared resources, and so there may be some sort of continuation of a theme of relationships having been more important, or having to put more focus on relationships over the course of the past month, especially in January and the first part of February as Mars is going through your 7th house. And then some of that energy carries forward into the topic of your partner's finances when Mars moves into the next sign, into Taurus, in the middle of February. So the sort of continuation of the topic there is relatively straightforward in terms of partnership and then shared resources. One person says, would the transition include a physical relocation to a new home? Or is this more with you in your past home, including your parents, like you said? It really depends on the individual natal chart. And Venus itself, changing signs and moving into the 4th house would not necessarily have to coincide with moving. For some of you, it very well could if Venus is activated as an important planet for you this year, but it's a relatively short-term transit that happens usually once a year. Venus will go through your 4th house. So typically it's a more sort of straightforward and easy, just pleasant time in terms of your home and living situation. And sometimes people redecorate or just do minor things in terms of their current living situation. And it doesn't have to be like a major thing or a major change. My focus on it this month is primarily because it sort of bookends the start of the month and the end of the month, and also because it's really offsetting some of the other heavy outer planet transits with Saturn and Pluto going through that sign, which are like long-term kind of looming and somewhat challenging transits that are going on here. And so it's really nice to have some counterbalance happening during the course of February. And it's not something that will be happening all year. So I think, let me know if you guys have any other questions. The only other transit that I meant to mention, or I thought about mentioning, was the Mercury retrograde transit that is actually coming up next month, but Mercury goes into its shadow and it gets queued up so that we get sort of a preview, or we get some of the stage will be set for the upcoming Mercury retrograde period in the second part of February. So here we can see that Mercury gets to about the middle of Pisces around February 18th, and it conjoins Neptune. And then it keeps moving, and normally that would be the end of it, and Mercury would just keep sailing forward after forming that conjunction with Neptune. But what happens is that Mercury actually slows down, and it stations retrograde in the beginning of March, and then begins moving backwards towards a second conjunction with Neptune, which it eventually completes, and it stations direct at 16 degrees of Pisces in late March. So it hits Neptune a second time, and then eventually it'll hit Neptune a third time, which means that we end up having 3 Mercury-Neptune conjunctions over the course of February, March, and April eventually, which is kind of a unique, not very common occurrence. So, backing it up to February, because we're starting to get a little far afield, and I want to be careful not to talk too much about what will end up being a major transit that I'll talk about in March. But I just wanted to mention it because it's queuing up a series of events in the second part of February when Mercury first hits that conjunction with Neptune and then slows down and starts getting ready to go retrograde towards the end of February. It's going to set the stage for what will happen during the Mercury retrograde period. So the way that that's particularly relevant for you is that for those of you with Libra rising, it's happening in your 6th house. The 6th house primarily has to do with 2 topics, which are either work, so your work and your workplace, or secondarily, it has to do with health and matters pertaining to your health. So, one of the potentials with Mercury retrogrades is always miscommunication, and that's sometimes heightened when Neptune is involved at the same time, because miscommunication is a pretty common Mercury-Neptune sort of manifestation, either miscommunication or sometimes deception, like being deceived somehow through communication, either deliberately or accidentally sometimes. So one of the things that you want to do is be very careful, or be extra careful in the later part of February, to be clear in your communications at work, or to be clear in your communications when it comes to your health. So as to avoid the worst possible manifestations of the Mercury retrograde when it happens in March, where miscommunications are going to be more likely. So basically, strive to be more careful and more clear in your communications in the second part of February, so that you don't create additional problems for yourself in your workplace. And additionally, in terms of health, if you have like doctor's appointments, or if you have other things that you're working on in terms of your health, try to be extra clear, both in communicating your needs to whoever you're talking to and working with, but also be extra careful that you are clear with what they are saying, and try to get things in writing, for example, is helpful, or other sorts of recordings can be helpful in order to sort of ward off, or attempt to ward off, some of the more challenging possible manifestations of that combination. So that would be my advice, and that was something I want to mention. We'll come back to that, of course, in March once the retrograde actually happens. But since Mercury enters its shadow period and moves over the degrees that it will later retrograde back to, I wanted to mention that to you so you can be aware of it as it's starting to get queued up and some of those events are starting to line up in your life. All right, I think that's bringing us to the later part of the end of this live stream, where I'm doing the horoscopes for Virgo and Virgo rising for February of 2019. It doesn't look like there's any more questions, so I think I covered everything that I could. So I think that might be it for this horoscope for February. So thanks everybody for joining me tonight. It's been fun. Let me know if you liked it. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/theastrologyschool. Be sure to follow me on Twitter so you can see future live streams. My Twitter handle is Chris Brennan 7, and I'm also on Facebook, so just search for me on Chris Brennan on Facebook, where I'm also doing live streams as well. All right, guys. Well, good luck with everything in February. I'll be back again next month probably to do the horoscopes for March. So good luck and have a good month in the meantime, and I will see you again in a few weeks. All right. See you later.